Ladies and gentlemen and distinguished guests, welcome to the Peter Cosgrove Centre here at Australian Catholic University. It's wonderful to have you here for the first of 4 Aletheia lectures for 2026. And they are hosted by our wonderful program that's called the Western Civilisation Program, and it's supported and funded and instigated by the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilisation, for whom we are most grateful. My name is Peter Anstey. I'm the director of the Western Civilisation Program, and it's a great honour for me tonight to introduce our speakers. Justice Ian Jackman is a judge of the Federal Court of Australia. Born in England, he came to Australia as a young boy, together with his family, and attended Knox Grammar School on the north side of Sydney. Following that, he went to Sydney University and received a Rhodes Scholarship to study law at Oxford. At Oxford, he attended Magdalen College and graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in Jurisprudence and a Bachelor of Civil Law. A lover of sport, Justice Jackman played rugby for Oxford University, for the Oxford Blues, in fact. And may I just put in a side comment here, this was in the era when Australia was very good at rugby. Around about the time that people like Nick Farr-Jones were playing. In fact, mentioning Nick Farr-Jones reminds me that Justice Jackman went to St Andrews College at Sydney University, and there is a close connection between St Andrews College and the Western Civilisation Program here at ACU. In 1989, Justice Jackman was appointed as a barrister of the Supreme Court of New South Wales, and he became senior counsel in 2002. At the bar, he specialised in commercial law and company law, and he was appointed to the Federal Court in February 2023, just as COVID was tapering off. Justice Jackman is not only a practitioner of the law, but also a scholar and theorist, having written an important and influential book called The Varieties of Restitution, first published in 1998, but has come out again in a second edition in 2017. And that is still making an impact in law, particularly as far as I understand, in Britain. Not only that, but Justice Jackman regularly writes and gives speeches. And can I recommend to our law students, many of whom who are here tonight, to go to the Federal Court website and look at some of the speeches that are available there by Justice Jackman. They range from issues pertaining to intellectual property to the use of AI in the law. Now, responding to Justice Jackman's talk tonight, or lecture tonight, is Justice Keith Mason AC. Justice Mason is also a graduate of the law school at the University of Sydney. He was Solicitor General of New South Wales from 1987 to 1997, after which he was sworn in as President of the New South Wales Court of Appeal. In 2003, Justice Mason was made a Companion of the Order of Australia. And it's a great honour to have you here tonight, Justice Mason. The title of Justice Jackman's lecture tonight is Civilisation and Citizenship, the Words and Deeds of Sir Victor Windeyer. Let's give him a round of applause as he comes to speak to us.
Thank you very much, Peter. In 1969, the BBC produced an extraordinary television series called Civilisation. The first episode begins with Kenneth Clark standing on the Pont des Arts in Paris. On one side of the Seine is the Institute of France. On the other side is the Louvre. And just visible upstream is the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Kenneth Clark poses the question, what is civilisation? and answers demurely, "I can't define it in abstract terms yet, but I think I can recognise it when I see it, and I'm looking at it now." Much the same can be said of citizenship, which is a cognate term also derived from the Latin civitas. I'm not talking of citizenship in the formal legal sense used in migration law, but as a moral concept. That concept is best captured by the perhaps old-fashioned term civic virtue, which has the merit of making explicit the etymological connection with the word civilisation. The interdependence of civilisation and citizenship in that sense was a fundamental theme of political ideas in ancient Greece and Rome. It resurfaced in the Italian Renaissance and again in the latter half of the 18th century, particularly in the Scottish Enlightenment and in the founding of the United States of America. In Australia, we have a tradition of laconic practicality, which encourages people simply to show, not tell. But judges have to expose reasons for their opinions and decisions, both in court and elsewhere, and my remarks this evening are focused on a High Court judge who was a great exemplar of civilisation and citizenship in both word and deed, and with a devotion and integrity which are unlikely to be surpassed. Sir Victor Windeyer was born in 1900. The day after his 18th birthday, he enlisted in the Australian Imperial Force, but the armistice was declared before he was sent overseas. He studied arts and law at the University of Sydney, winning the University Medal in History in 1922. From 1919, he served in what later became known as the Sydney University Regiment, becoming its commanding officer in 1937. He practised as a barrister from 1925 and also lectured part-time at the University of Sydney in legal history, ethics and equity, writing 2 legal textbooks. In 1940, Windeyer was sent as Lieutenant Colonel to South Australia to command the 2nd 48th Infantry Battalion, which turned out to be the most highly decorated Australian battalion in the war. It was unusual then for a commanding officer to be appointed from another state. He led the unit in the defence of Tobruk in 1941 and was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his inspirational courage and example. Let me quote from the contemporaneous unit diary of Windeyer's 2nd 48th Battalion for 17 to 18 April 1941 at the beginning of the siege of Tobruk, when the battalion kept a German armoured force out along a 4-mile front, despite being a number of officers short and having a deficiency in equipment. Every officer has complete confidence in Lieutenant Colonel W.J.V. Windeyer as the, quote, old man, unquote. So far, his leadership has been sure and faultless, and his energy, both mental and physical, is untiring. We all realise our commanding officer is a thinker, and this, allied with an undoubted fighting spirit, has captured the imagination of all ranks and augurs well for the battalion's future. In 1942, he was promoted to the rank of brigadier in command of the 20th Brigade, which took a prominent part in the crucial Battle of El Alamein. Windeyer's tactical skills earned him a bar to his DSO. The brigade was then deployed to New Guinea and later Borneo to fight the Japanese. For this service, he was awarded the CBE. After the war, Windeyer resumed his service in the citizen military forces. He was promoted to Major General, commanded the 2nd Division from 1950 to 1952, and was the CMF member of the Military Board from 1950 to 1953, being awarded the honour of CB for his work there. He was appointed King's Counsel in 1949 and acted as counsel assisting the Royal Commission on Espionage in 1955, often referred to as the Petrov Royal Commission. He maintained his interest in education, serving as a trustee of Sydney Grammar School for 28 years, a Fellow of the Senate of the University of Sydney for 11 years, including 4 years as Deputy Chancellor, and a member of the Council of the Australian National University for 5 years. In addition, he was a Director of CSR, MLC, Commercial Union Assurance, and the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital in Sydney, and was President of the New South Wales Boy Scouts Association. In 1958, Windeyer was appointed a Justice of the High Court of Australia and served for 14 years in that capacity. His biography is itself an outstanding example of qualities of civilisation and citizenship. In addition, his judgments provide a rich source of material on those themes, and we also have his former associate and a distinguished judge in his own right, the Honourable Bruce DeBell, to thank for an excellent collection of Windeyer's speeches and articles. That outstanding book reveals Windeyer's innate dignity, his literary brilliance, his broad mind, and his generous heart. Reading his judgments now, one is immediately struck by the profusion of historical and literary allusions. His replacement on the High Court, Sir Ninian Stephen, put the point well in saying that Windeyer's great scholarship and mastery of the written word have long turned law into literature. Let me give some examples. In a judgment departing from the House of Lords on principles concerning exemplary damages in defamation, Justice Windeyer said that the departure indicates no breaking of the ties light as air. That subtle and evocative expression was taken from Edmund Burke's speech on conciliation with America in 1775, but perhaps in light of events in North America the following year, Windeyer tactfully omitted the next words, that the ties are as strong as links of iron. In the same judgment, Justice Windeyer reworked Alfred Lord Tennyson's line from Locksley Hall that the jingling of the guinea helps the hurt that honour feels, in saying, guineas got from the defendant jingle more pleasantly than would those given by a sympathetic friend. In a case concerning causation of a fatal coronary occlusion, he adopted a phrase from John Milton's beautiful elegy Lycidas in saying, in the last analysis, it is death itself that slits the thin-spun life. That reminds me of a case before the New South Wales Court of Appeal when my opponent referred to what he said was Sir Owen Dixon's aphorism in the automatic fire sprinklers case, that they also serve who only stand and wait. That most cultivated judge, Mr. Justice R.P. Maher, leant forward and said, "How strange. I always thought that was Milton's sonnet on his blindness." Judges are not generally touched by the poet's sensibility, but there have been notable exceptions. Windeyer regarded a well-rounded education as not just a hallmark of civilisation, but also as a preparation for citizenship. In a speech entitled The Faculty of Arts and the Community, Windeyer adopted John Henry Newman, who I note was recently canonised, to the effect that if a practical end must be assigned to a university course, then I say it is the training of good members of society. He admired the early undergraduates of the University of Sydney, whom he described as follows: whether rich or poor, they came, generally speaking, from homes where books were kept, where the value of a liberal education was never doubted, where a false quantity was detected, where people took time to write letters, where to the discussion of the problems of the day it was assumed one should bring the experience of the Greeks and Romans who had had these problems and had left their views upon them. Those early undergraduates, who included Sir Samuel Griffith and Sir Edmund Barton, liked to be masters of words, and as masters to keep them in their proper places and to make each do its proper work. Windeyer added, for them, patriotism was an unquestioned virtue. It was the state, not a section, which they professed to serve. Those last words were drawn from Macaulay's poem Horatius, and for that display of erudition, I'm grateful to his son Bill, who remembers his father preparing that speech and calling out to him for the correct words, which he managed to remember. The proper use of history in legal analysis was a frequent topic in Windeyer's judgments and speeches. In the marriage case in 1962, he was critical of what he called mere antiquarian learning and said that the only reason for going back into the past is to come forward to the present, to help us to see more clearly the shape of the law today by seeing how it took shape. History, he said, should be read as a narrative of a movement from the past towards the present, and unlike the method of the genealogist, we should not be concerned to find an early ancestor of a doctrine or rule unless by this one can better understand its progeny. He said if we read history only backwards, we lose the sense of growth, of expansion and evolution. He regarded history as an ever-moving stream in which the present can never be separated rigidly from the past, for always the present is becoming the past. For the student of law, history thus teaches that our law is moving forward as part of the main body of our history as social conditions and ideas change. Windeyer said that it is the lawyers who have been moved by a sense of history rather than those whose approach has been strictly analytical who have been the more ready to be reformers. And that is because, he said, although they have looked at the past, they've taken from it a sense of the dynamic of the law and thus have looked to the future. Although Windeyer was a conservative in many respects, he was certainly not a reactionary. He admired the common law's inherent capacity for development, but saw that as an incremental process. In Smith and Jenkins, he used an architectural metaphor. We must, of course, build upon established foundations and without destroying the symmetry of the existing building. But we need not be fearful of making additions to fill vacant spaces if they accord with what is already standing. In Benning and Wong, he drew on his military experience in cautioning that those who insist that the common law is still on the move should remember that it must always march in step. Decisions in cases passing at the moment must be in step with those which have just gone past, although not necessarily with those at the head of the column. Moving the metaphor from the parade ground to the field, it is as sound a maxim for law as for war that operations should be from a firm base, that an advance must be made from a position which has been securely established. That last maxim was taken from General Montgomery's pamphlet, Brief Notes for Senior Officers on the Conduct of Battle, written in 1942 after the Battle of El Alamein. Let me take that conception of the ongoing vitality of the common law a step further. One sees in much of Windeyer's writing a conception of judicial decision-making as embodying the reasonable expectations of ordinary people. That might sound an obvious proposition today, but it should be borne in mind that the High Court of Australia at that time was dominated by a kind of legal formalism which tended to regard the application of the law as an exercise in strict logic from a closed set of legal premises. Windeyer adopted a different stance, which he described in the first chapter of his Lectures on Legal History as follows: "Law is not, in essence, a body of technical rules, uncouth formulae, and inexorable commands, mysteries which only the learned may know, and with the subtle distinctions of which only a dialectician can wrestle. It is really a simpler and grander thing. It is that which makes it possible for men to live together in communities, to lead a peaceful, organised social life." Let me give two examples of this civilised approach. In Kobiak and Liddy, Windeyer said, in relation to whether a statute prescribing minimum sentences permitted some discretion, "The whole history of criminal justice has shown that severity of punishment begets the need of a capacity for mercy. That is not because mercy, in Portia's sense, should season justice. It is that a capacity in special circumstances to avoid the rigidity of inexorable law is of the very essence of justice." Next, consider the human sympathy in the way that he described Cable and Sinclair, the very first civil case tried in New South Wales in 1788, in which a convict couple with a 2-year-old child successfully sued the master of one of the ships in the First Fleet for failing to deliver a parcel containing their possessions. This is what Justice Windeyer said: "They were young, they were uneducated, their station in life was a humble one, and they were serving a sentence for a crime. They might have expected humiliation rather than help. The defendant, on the other hand, was a person of importance, the master of a vessel about to leave Port Jackson. The proceedings of the court were a vindication of the rule of law." There is a negligence case decided by the High Court which I think is particularly illuminating in this regard. In Mount Isa Mines and Pusey in 1970, 2 employees who were testing a switchboard were electrocuted and horribly burnt, and it was found that their employer had negligently failed to instruct them properly in their duties. The claim was brought by another employee who went at once to the gruesome scene and assisted in carrying one of the injured workers to an ambulance. About 4 weeks later, he suffered what lawyers at the time referred to as nervous shock. A parent or close relative who witnessed such an incident was at that time clearly recognised as having a right to claim. But what about a fellow employee? Justice Windeyer does not refer expressly to his battlefield experience, but the distinction between a family member and an employee would not have made sense to someone who had seen firsthand the psychiatric effects on soldiers who had witnessed traumatic casualties. And his judgment does contain an insightful military metaphor that law, marching with medicine, but in the rear and limping a little, has come a long way since the 1880s. One finds a similar theme to the law embodying the reasonable expectations of ordinary people in the context of constitutional law, in the notion that the text of the Constitution should be interpreted in the light of the political reality of nationhood that has developed within its framework. That emerges most clearly in the payroll tax case in 1971, in which Justice Windeyer referred to the colonies becoming components of a federal nation in 1901, but then saying its nationhood was in the course of time to be consolidated in war, by economic and commercial integration, by the unifying influence of federal law, by the decline of dependence upon British naval and military power, and by a recognition and acceptance of external interests and obligations. Justice Windeyer then referred to the landmark engineers case in 1920, which discarded the doctrine of the implied immunity of the states as not the correction of antecedent errors or the uprooting of heresy, but as reading the Constitution in a new light, a light reflected from events that had over 20 years led to a growing realisation that Australians were now one people and Australia one country, and that national laws might meet national needs. In his J.A. Weir Memorial Lecture in Edmonton, Canada in 1972, he explained his view of the engineer's case as a demonstration that in a country which has inherited the common law as its essential characteristic, a capacity to grow and develop as the needs of people change can govern fundamental law and even the concepts that a written constitution embodies. To pick up an expression which Justice Windeyer used in a slightly earlier constitutional case, the law has followed the facts. That phrase can be traced back to a speech he gave in 1956 on the development of responsible government, saying in relation to New South Wales, the law followed the facts at a respectful distance, but with constant pressure for the closing of the gap. He concluded his J.A. Weir lectures by saying, "It is not impertinent when reading the words of the Constitution, words intended to endure and to have a meaning in new circumstances, to remember St. Paul's adjuration that it is the Spirit that giveth life. The Spirit is continually present. It is not chained by the letter to unyielding precedents of the past. It is the spirit of the common law of England." Let me now draw these threads together by taking up an idea which Windeyer often deployed in his judgments and speeches, the concept of cultural and intellectual inheritance. We perhaps tend to think of an inheritance in terms of ownership of something created by the efforts of our forebears for us to deal with as we please. Windeyer used the term in a more profound and continuous sense, more akin to stewardship or trusteeship than ownership. An inheritance, he said, is not so much something handed down as something to be handed on to an heir. That strikes me as corresponding closely to Edmund Burke's vision of society as a partnership not only between those who are living, but also between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are yet to be born. That's a natural way in which to view the common law, being the body of English law which we have inherited. Windeyer said that we take that inheritance as a universal legatee. We take its method and its spirit, as well as its particular rules, recognising that further developments and fresh refinements are still going on, and that the background and conditions against which the law operates are not the same in England as in Australia. The common law is thus, as he said, an ancient and living tradition. Windeyer's approach may be contrasted with Voltaire, who said in his revolutionary zeal, "If you want good laws, burn those you have and make new ones." On other occasions, Windeyer spoke in broader terms of the inheritance of European Christian civilisation, as in the marriage case, which raised fundamental questions about the institution of marriage. As a historian, he doubted whether Australia, on its own, really constitutes a proper unit of historical study in isolation from the history of its European heritage. Those who are interested in the Christian influence on modern liberal democratic thought should read Larry Seidentop's great work, Inventing the Individual, published in 2014. The central themes of that book resemble closely the way that Windeyer put the matter in a speech in 1966 to the 13th Dominion Law Conference in New Zealand, in explaining how the common law is part of our broader civilisation and culture, saying, "To the way of life that is ours, with its decencies, dignity, tolerance, and Christian kindliness, the law has contributed more stern and outward concepts of equal justice, of the liberty of the individual, of the subordination of government to the rule of law. Although he recognised that the institutional influence of the Church had diminished or been expelled by modern secular philosophy and by what he referred to as a generous toleration of conflicting beliefs, he said that the moral values of Christianity, based very often on the values of Judaism, continue to pervade the common law and to point out the ways of its development. I should add for completeness that while he found much to admire in our inheritance of Western civilization, he did not regard colonisation as entirely and unequivocally good, and said, for example, that the early history of contact of whites and blacks in Australia is on the whole melancholy and in parts cruel and shameful, notwithstanding provisions made long ago by the states for the welfare and protection of the Aboriginal inhabitants. Fundamental to the idea of citizenship is a moral imperative to nurture and enhance that inheritance. As citizens, we are duty-bound to hold fast to the good things in our inheritance in order to pass them on, and we have no right to disinherit the next generation. Windia once wrote of war memorials, for example, as speaking of deeds and reminding of inheritance, and said that to fulfil their purpose, they should evoke a question and suggest an answer. A war memorial, he said, should speak of a nation's heritage and call generation upon generation to ask, quid pro tanto retribuamus? What shall we give back in return for so much? The question is taken from Psalms 116, verse 12. Let me digress for a moment and widen the bounds of this discussion and pick up the theme of words and deeds and their interrelationship. That interrelationship between words and deeds was a matter of intense interest for Athenians in the 5th century BC. The word logos, meaning speech, reason and argument, hence our word logic, and the word ergon, meaning action or results, hence our word erg in physics, being a unit of work or energy. The statesman and general Pericles said, "We do not think logos is an obstacle to action. No, the issue is the failure to use logos before action has to be taken." Socrates argued that logos without action was worthless and amounted merely to verbal assertion or hypocrisy. When Aristotle tackled the question, what is a good life, he insisted that logos alone was not enough. It must be a life of reason concerned with action. In other words, the person leading a good life manages to integrate the intellect with resolute action and shows the mind's capacity to dominate the irrational impulses and external circumstances that try to overwhelm it. It would perhaps be unrealistic to think that we are capable of giving back to our civilization as citizens as much as Windia himself gave. Very few of us are likely to serve in uniform or to display the courage and self-sacrifice of those who did. It's worth recalling that every British Prime Minister from 1940 to 1963 had served in armed combat. That certainly gave them a seriousness of purpose. I'm not seeking to glorify war, which is a malignant scourge in human history, and in my experience, soldiers themselves share that view, as they're the ones most acutely familiar with the suffering and sacrifice that war entails. But I do think that a desk is a limited place from which to experience and view the world. Most importantly, theirs was a generation which understood that it is through the practice of citizenship that civilization is held together. Sadly, The self, rather than society, has begun to matter more to people, and selflessness is at the heart of citizenship. Windeyer put it eloquently when he spoke to the 20th Brigade at a service of Thanksgiving in Western Brunei, 6 days after the end of the war in the Pacific in August 1945, when he remembered those who had fallen in battle and then referred to those qualities which united the soldiers under his command. This is what he said: "It is the simple things we have respected in our friends in the army. Speaking truth, taking a fair share of the work, cheerfulness, doing a good job and being ready to help the other man do his job, not letting the show down. Those are the things which have kept whole units together and made victory possible. They've been greater than many differences of rank and of opinion and of feeling. In our different interests and different tasks in civil life, we may remember that those things were good." That is a powerful statement in its everyday attainability. It speaks of ordinary matters of civic mindedness and fellow feeling among citizens in their daily lives in peacetime. These were citizens who saw their civilisation in danger and fought as citizens conscious of their civic duty for its defence. They deserve the description which Pericles gave to the Athenian dead in the 5th century BC, whose story abides everywhere without visible symbol, woven into the stuff of other men's lives.
What shall we give back in return for so much? It's a pleasure now to invite Justice Keith Mason to respond, and welcome to the podium, Your Honour.
Thank you, and good evening. I'm sure you will agree that we've been privileged to hear a most thoughtful reflection about Sir Victor Windeyer. He was a brilliant leader and jurist, and a man of his time who left many pearls of timeless wisdom. Ian Jackman and I go back a long way. We were barristers together. For a period, we were both at the same church at Hunters Hill, where the suburb where Victor was born, and whose father was the mayor of Hunters Hill. Ian and I have shared gentle scholarly discourse about the topic of restitution, and we have much respect for each other. I won't disclose any of Ian's secrets, but I'll shortly reveal one of my own in relation to Sir Victor. I propose to touch very briefly on 4 topics in my own reflections about Windeyer. They are all linked alliteratively by the letter H. In making this stretch, I acknowledge that Windeyer was definitely not educated by Irish nuns. And I admit that Windeyer's contemporaries, Dixon and Kitto, would have been shocked. But Sir Victor was never a pedant. First, happenstance. In August 1970, I turned down an offer from Sir Victor to become his associate on the High Court, and I would have been his last associate had I accepted. My final year at Sydney University was 1969, I planned to finish my articles, practice as a solicitor for a short time, go to London to do a postgraduate degree at London School of Economics, return and start at the bar in February 1972, which is what I did. February 72 was the month in which Sir Victor retired from the High Court of Australia. Having made all the arrangements, bought my Qantas student flight to London via Greece, if I recollect. It was only weeks before I was to depart, and I got this phone call. Windier here. I said, yes. Sir Victor, by that stage I was standing to attention. He said, Walsh tells me you want to be an associate. I had applied to be Sir Cyril Walsh's associate and been unsuccessful. Sir Victor said, come up and see me. I thought, what do I do? What do I do? I came up. He did offer me the position, but as I say, it was less than 3 weeks before I was due to set off for London, and I regretfully declined. To our Ramsay scholars here, I'd like to say that life will present you with many forks in the road. You will not know necessarily which route to take. You may not perceive how significant the choices were when you are offered them. You may think later about those choices. I'm not in any way regretting the opportunities I got from a year studying in London, but I do often think about what life would have been like had I gone the other way. One thing is certain, nobody could have done as good a job as Bruce de Bell in preserving Sir Victor's legacy. So from the point of view of legal historiography, it was a good choice for me to say thank you, Sir Victor, but no thank you. Next, humour and humanity. Windier was one of a small group of highly educated men in the law who were skilled in the classics and classical languages. That was just the way things were for this quite numerically small group of people in Sydney and Melbourne. It was a generation that had included George Rich, Frederick Jordan, Frank Kitto, and of course Owen Dixon. Some of the men in that group were decidedly patrician and elitist and lived within a fairly closed, bookish world in which logic predominated, as Ian indicated in some of his points about Windier's skills. The story was told of an exchange between Sir Owen Dixon and Bernard Riley, who was a member of the Legislative Council and a King's Counsel in Sydney, later a judge. Dixon, I've recently heard a wonderfully amusing joke, Riley. I suppose I could tell it to you in Greek. Riley, no, it's one of the regrets of my life that I have no Greek. Dixon, well then perhaps Latin will suffice. Riley, I regret that whilst I studied it at school, my Latin is very rusty. Dixon, well then there's no point in telling you the joke. Sir Victor had scholarship and learning, including learning of language in spades, but he could definitely relate to the common man, as his brilliant military career demonstrated. And he never wrote as if the law existed within a self-referential logical bubble, as his historical discourse demonstrated. His writings and judgments are replete with gentle puns, double entendres, and learned quips. In an address to graduating dentists, he said, "Despite the assurance of the psalmist that the Lord hath broken the teeth of the ungodly, there appears to be little connection between dental decay and moral delinquency. The righteous, no less than the unrighteous, all need your skilled, if unwelcomed, attentions." Windeyer once wrote that the phrase res ipsa loquitur has not been allowed to speak for itself. History. As we heard, Windeyer was the university medalist in history in the 1920s. His deep historical learning permeated, informed, and brightened his judgments. But he didn't refer to history or spout it for its own sake. In a passage that has already been mentioned, Windeyer said that the only reason for going back into the past is to come forward to the present, to help us to see more clearly the shape of the law today by seeing how it took shape. Of course, Windeyer was speaking about the use of history in the practical legal discourse of advocacy and judging. History, of course, may be studied in its own right for the sheer pleasure. And I must say, the older I get, the more that's the way I enter history. On one occasion, Windeyer said that a judge is a working part of the crew of a vessel, the courts, for which each case is a separate voyage. He has not the time to be a cartographer of lands discovered. That is the task which is undertaken by academic writers. Humour and history combined when he observed in Cam and Sons and Ramsay that all officers and ministers ought to serve the Crown according to the laws. It may be desirable that sometimes people be reminded of this and of the fate of James II. We study and treasure the past for many reasons, not all of them as practical as the art of appellate judging. But Windeyer's approach to legal history offers an important insight for an organisation such as the one sponsoring this event. I shall try to clarify this observation by elaborating on my earlier reference to Sir Victor as a man of his time. For well over a generation, every Australian law student studied legal history using Windeyer's masterly lectures on legal history. Only the last of its 35 chapters touched upon Australia, and it was entitled, quote, "The Introduction of English Law into Australia." This was, of course, how things were understood before the researches of Professors Alex Castles and Bruce Kircher brought to light many variations at this frontier of empire. And it was before the Chief Justiceship of the late Sir Anthony Mason. At law school, we also studied the particular topic of the reception of English law through the prism of Windeyer's 1961 lecture called A Birthright and Inheritance. The opening section of that lecture was headed "An Uninhabited Country Planted by English Subjects." It applied to New South Wales in 1770, William Blackstone's category of what would later be labelled terra nullius. That, of course, was the law of the land under the Privy Council decision of Cooper and Stewart, 1889. Windeyer raised but the slightest eyebrow in a footnote which stated, "Countries inhabited only by savage or uncivilised peoples were within the doctrine," but he did place quotation marks around the word savage and uncivilised. Historical studies, and this is an example of law following the facts, historical studies post-Windia would lead the High Court, as we all know, in Mabo, to declare that Cooper and Stewart rested upon false history, and bolder judges than Windia's generation would recalibrate that law in light of that historical reorientation. This is in no way put as a criticism of Sir Victor, but it is a reminder that history and the law are, like most other things in life, topics under constant revision. This offers a warning about the proper use of our changing understandings of the past. In the words of Benjamin Cardozo, we may try to see things as objectively as we please. Nonetheless, we can never see them with any eyes except our own. This organisation is to be highly commended for its work in the intellectual formation of its Ramsay scholars, some of whom I've had the pleasure of meeting tonight. It does not assume the impossible task of investing them with a fixed vision of the past. Indeed, it surely looks forward to the time when these gifted young people will, with confidence, assume responsibility for their own present and their nation's future. Thank you.
Well, we move now to an opportunity for the audience here to ask questions. And Justice Jackman, I'd ask that you come to the front. Thank you. And we have some roving mics. We have one roving mic. So can I ask that you put your hand up and just keep it up, and Natalie will come to you with the mic at some point. I wanted to start the ball rolling and just ask, Your Honour, about this formalism in the High Court that you alluded to. Where did that come from, and why was it that in that court they had, as you intimated, lost a sense of the importance and history of history?
Well, it's usually attributed to the dominant influence of Sir Owen Dixon, who is widely, if not universally, regarded as our greatest ever High Court judge. But he did believe in what he called strict legal formalism. He was a very brilliant man, and as Keith's speech indicated, a very erudite classical scholar, but he lacked the experience of the world which Sir Victor Windia had had, and which I think probably influenced Sir Victor in taking a rather different view. But Dixon was an extraordinarily dominating figure on the High Court, and although it may well be possible to trace it, that formalism back to an earlier time, the fact that it survived for so long throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s, I think was due to Dixon's influence.
Yes, we have a question up the back.
Thank you, Your Honour, for your very illuminating talk. We've heard a lot tonight about the importance of history and carrying on from the first question. For legal students today, we don't have a specific study of legal history. Lots of us aren't exposed to Sir Victor Windia's lectures, for example, and we're also facing a context in which the common law is much less emphasised and statute is becoming more significant. So I suppose, what would you say to law students as they approach studying the law with a mind to history, given how the application of history is evolving talking about, I guess, the connection between logos and its application. Thank you.
Very good question. I think you've certainly identified quite rightly a couple of ways in which legal history is probably not as important as it used to be because, as you say, a lot of our law is now statutory rather than common law. The study of history more generally, so let's put to one side legal history as a rather specialist interest and think about history in general. The study of history will make anyone a better lawyer in a couple of ways which I can immediately think of. One is in the use of evidence. Now, a historian is a lot more free in the use of evidence than a lawyer or a judge, and a historian isn't bound by any rules of evidence, but one learns a great deal from the study of history about the proper use of evidence, what inferences can be drawn, what weight can be given to certain sources. So that's one aspect. The other thing which I certainly got out of the study of history at university was that you begin with the facts and you build up from the facts a conception of themes. And that is very similar to the technique of the common law, where one looks at a series of individual cases, each with their multifarious facts, and one builds up from that a principle which unites the way in which those cases have been decided. And so I think the historian's training in building up themes from facts is very similar to the way that a lawyer identifies principles. And because the subject matter of history is just so intrinsically fascinating, is perhaps a more intellectually rewarding way of learning those skills than diving straight into legal analysis.
Thank you, Justice Chapman, for the speech. I know you might be limited by what you can say on this, but I wonder what your thoughts are on the role of legal history when creating statute, particularly in areas such as, for example, criminal law, where new offences are being created, perhaps without looking to how the tradition has developed over time. Is the role of legal history in the creation of statute different to the role of legal history in the creation of the common law? And is it less so or more so?
Well, I think that's another very good question. Thank you. I think it's important, if one's dealing with statutory innovation, to have a broader perspective. One of the phenomena of the current age is whenever there's a particular problem which has arisen, our parliamentarians will immediately think up a new crime to try to solve it. It's not necessarily the best approach, and one ends up with a miscellany of rather time-bound criminal provisions, and one starts to lose a sense of coherence and structure in the law as a result. So I think having a broader historical perspective would certainly assist our lawmakers in their approach to innovating in the criminal area. But the use of history in terms of arguing or applying statutes is more limited than the common law. The common law really demands that one have a historical perspective because the common lawyer looks at a landscape rather like a geologist. Different eras coexist even though they're in a very different chronological time frame, and irrespective of their chronological order, the common law can treat an old case as being just as important as a very new one. But I still do think, however, that historical perspective is useful when it comes to statutes, but not as useful.
Thank you. I echo the sentiments of a fantastic talk. My question is more towards Windeyer himself, being a part of the British Empire and then being an Australian, and how these two, I guess, competing or similar conceptions of yourself as an Australian citizen or a member of the British Empire might have informed his judgments, and whether you could speak to that at all.
Well, there are people in the audience who are very well qualified to answer that, not me. But from what I have read in his judgments and speeches, he was a figure of his time in terms of being an Anglophile. He did from time to time refer to England as home. It wasn't his personal home, but I think he regarded it as a cultural home. And Australia was a very different country during his lifetime in that regard. He was patriotic, and he was a patriotic Australian. But I don't think he saw that as being at all inconsistent with being Anglophile. Are there nods from the front row? But thank you.
Yeah, thank you for a very stimulating talk. My question is of something of a more philosophical nature. You mentioned in your talk that it's seldom the case that a judge is moved by the poet's sentiments. But I was thinking about the cases in which there are exceptions. Those exceptions seem to be cases in which things that are traditionally conceived of as outside the court of law, outside the sphere of law, that are the matter that the poets deal with, that the novelists write about and that the philosophers think about and so on, kind of become, they seem to intrude in a certain sense into the court of law. And this seems to generate a sort of problem which has been particularly famously put by Kafka in his novel The Trial, and of course Dickens in Bleak House, in which he quips toward the beginning that in the interminable case of Jarndyce and Jarndyce, some people have died in it, people have been born into it, and there are people who are yet unborn who have their lives shaped by it. So that seems to be phrasing the problem from the other perspective, where the courts of law kind of end up the arteries of society that are invisible, that determine people's lives and so on. And I think that legal formalism seems to be at least one consistent approach to sort of solving this by cordoning off the courts of law into a particular science. But I suppose the question is, how would you consider the relationship of the chambers of courts of law in respect to the rest of society? And is there a sort of a hard distinction where the science of law ends and the other sciences of Western civilization begin?
Well, I'm very much in the Windeyer camp in thinking that one shouldn't look at law as a self-contained unit of study, and the more literature and the more history one is exposed to, especially as a young student, but throughout life, the better one is going to be as a lawyer, for a number of reasons. It keeps your mind much better rounded. It cures one of, I suppose, an excessive bleakness, which legal analysis tends to inculcate in us. And it keeps the mind fresh to ideas and open to different experiences and ways of expression. And apart from anything else, it makes life much richer and more enjoyable if one keeps expanding one's mind and and not limiting the way that one thinks to one's professional activities. I think that applies to any profession actually, but it certainly applies to the law because we're dealing not just with intellectual problems, we're dealing with human problems, and one needs not to lose sight of the humanity which underscores the law.
Thank you for your talk, Your Honour. We've spoken a lot about how legal history in particular has been a great influence on your legal mind and your jurisprudence, and certainly for Sir Windeyer, how some of his civic participation, particularly in the military, influenced his outlook on the law. So I was wondering, from a practical perspective, for us law students, what might be some other examples of influences on your own jurisprudence and outlook on the law in other disciplines or in practical life, how we can cultivate a better mind and approach towards the law that's not so black letter?
Well, I had the very good fortune to marry a non-lawyer who's here tonight, and I also had the very good fortune of making a lot of friends, especially at university, who didn't go into law. Keeping a wide range of friendships outside your professional circle, and if you have the good fortune to marry someone who doesn't come from your own profession, then you can't become too obsessed with your professional activities. And it's actually a very good check on one's own thinking at home to explain a case to one's non-lawyer wife and non-lawyer children, because it forces you to see the case in very simple terms with no legal jargon, and quite often the task of explaining a case in that way can give you an insight that you'd missed in the privacy of your chambers. In practical terms, keep a wide circle of friends and welcome the opportunity, if they're curious, to tell them what you're doing and why you find it interesting. And you'll find you learn more about it by explaining it to non-lawyers than you might have done otherwise.
Thank you very much, Your Honour, for your speech. I think I really appreciated what you said about citizenship as safeguarding like a civilizational inheritance. I wonder what advice you would give to uni students who are, particularly law students, who are wanting to safeguard and to continue to hold this civilizational inheritance, especially in an age shaped by AI, when the way that a lot of people engage with information and the way that a lot of people engage with learning is changing very, very fast. And yeah, what sort of practical advice would you give to people wanting to go into law and wanting to continue to study the past and be shaped by it, when a lot of people are outsourcing their formation to something without that sort of rich heritage?
Well, the simple answer to the question is to minimise your screen time and maximise your contact with other students. It saddens me that a lot of university students, and I'm not now talking about the Ramsay Centre students, but a lot of students are taking their classes online, rarely going to the campus, rarely participating in student activities, whether they're sporting activities or cultural activities, not really forming the kinds of friendships that in our generation sprang up naturally because you were surrounded by a lot of interesting people whose company was most enjoyable. The other thing that we used to find in our generation was that we tended to learn just as much from our fellow students as we did from our tutors and lecturers, because after a lecture or a tutorial or beforehand, you would tend to talk about some of the issues that were cropping up in the lecture or tutorial, and one would learn a tremendous amount from fellow students by listening to their own point of view. So my advice is stand up against the tide and adhere to the old-fashioned thing of having a lot to do in person with your fellow students and getting stuck into as many sporting and cultural activities as you can.
Any more questions from the floor? Well, just as I opened the Q&A, I would like to ask the final question, and that is to do with where you think the law is heading in relation to artificial intelligence. We know that you've spoken on this, and I know that this is a little bit of a Pandora's box, but to hear from a Justice of the Federal Court about his or her view of AI and the law it's a very, very enticing subject. So what's your view?
First of all, AI can do marvellous things. It's tremendously useful in research. It is tremendously useful in the dullest of all legal tasks, the discovery of documents, which people who do it tell me would be, in many cases, would be almost impossible without using AI, because electronic communications have meant that there are so many more documents in existence now, and in order to locate the ones that are relevant, it's almost oppressive to do it in the old-fashioned way. AI probably has a role in the drafting of documents, but that's not an area that I'm very familiar with. In terms of drafting documents, I mean, my view is that AI would be better used as a last resort rather than a first resort. And as a last resort, it could be a very useful cross-check, because every lengthy contract has glitches in it. And AI might be able to pick those up in a way that has escaped the human mind. So that's all on the positive side. On the negative side, I very firmly draw the line against the use of AI in evidence, because I'm strongly of the view that evidence must be in the witness's own language, and most evidence in chief now is given in written form by way of affidavit or witness statement, and it horrifies me to think that some people might think, I don't think they do, but maybe they do, think it's appropriate to use AI to do a first draft of an affidavit. The question which fascinates me at the moment and is being discussed very widely among my colleagues is the spectre of the robo-judge. And I mean, a couple of years ago, people would have just laughed at the prospect. But it's actually now very prevalent in the People's Republic of China, where a lot of judgments are being drafted by AI as a first resort, and that may well suit the regime there, which no doubt wants judges to think in a uniform way. There are judges in the United States who are starting to come clean and say that they use AI to write the first draft of a judgment. They, of course, insist that it's only the first draft and there's careful supervision and checking, but if I can admit to a prejudice, which may be unfair, but it's a prejudice I'm reasonably comfortable with, I think the judge who uses AI as a first draft is probably not the most diligent and conscientious judge, and one is entitled to be sceptical about the degree of supervision and checking. But that, to my mind, is an enormous problem, because AI has no conception of reality, no conception of truth. It's very good at predicting what a human being would say in answer to a particular set of prompts, and its skill at predicting what people would say is the reason we have so many repetitive outcomes from AI, or what's called slop. But a judge in deciding a case must bring to bear experience of the real world at all sorts of different levels. At the most basic level, you have to decide between inconsistent evidence, which witness is going to be preferred, or someone wants to persuade you to draw an inference where the evidence hasn't filled in all the gaps. Now, you need to draw on your experience of the real world in order to set about that task. And I think litigants would be absolutely horrified if they thought that AI was being used at all by judges in drafting judgments, even as a first draft, because they want a human being with experience of the world and experience of reality to decide their case, and they want that human being to be able to explain in his or her own words how they reach that conclusion. That's another problem with AI, that no human being, it's become so complex, no human being now can actually explain how it gets the particular outputs that it gets. And explainability is absolutely fundamental to judging. So, long-winded answer, but thank you for the question, Peter.
Very,
It's a really
very
good one.
wonderful answer. Thank you. Can I just say, we're going to thank our speakers in a moment, but can I just say, particularly to our law students who are present, that there is a lot of legal nous amongst us tonight. Tonight was set up as a special event to focus on Western civilisation and the law and the history of law in Australia. I'm sure that you're all well satisfied. I encourage our law students to speak to the three justices who are here this evening. I haven't introduced Chief Justice Bell, but he is here in the front row as well. Take the opportunity to speak to them. Talk to them about your program, your direction, your intellectual persona as it's being shaped here in the Western Civilisation program. But most of all, let's thank our speakers tonight for a wonderful, wonderful evening.